Good morning, everyone. Let's get to it. I'm here to introduce our preacher, our guest this morning, Dr. Thelathia Nikki Young. Dr. Thelathia Young, affectionately called Nikki by many who know her, is a partner, parent, friend, and lifelong learner who prides herself in cultivating and sustaining transformative relationships. With credentials from UNC Asheville, Candler School of Theology, and Emory University Graduate Division of Religion, and nearly 20 years of service as a social justice advocate, ethicist, educator, and researcher of how and why social, political, and material disparities relate to embodied difference and connect to larger systems of privilege, power, and oppression, Dr. Young is a much needed voice in this space and in society today. Currently, Dr. Young is employed at Bucknell University as Interim Associate Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion after receiving tenure and promotion to Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and Religion in 2018. She's author of Black Queer Ethics, Family and Philosophical Imagination, and co-author of In Tongues of Mortals and Angels, a deconstructive theology of God talk in Acts and Corinthians, as well as a work in progress about queer theology. A Black queer ethicist, unbound by the parameters the world has tried to impress upon her relational and intellectual life, I unequivocally think Dr. Young the future of ethics. So may we listen, may we learn, but first may we warmly welcome Dr. Thelathia Nikki Young.
So I'm not her, of course. The sacred text, Galatians 5:13 through 14. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Audre Lorde, the uses of anger, women responding to racism. I am a lesbian woman of color whose children eat regularly because I work in a university. If their full bellies make me fail to recognize my commonality with the woman of color whose children do not eat because she cannot find work, or who has no children because her insides are rotted from home abortions and sterilization, if I fail to recognize the lesbian who chooses not to have children, the woman who remains closeted because her homophobic community is her only life support, the woman who chooses silence instead of another death, the woman who is terrified lest my anger trigger the explosion of hers, if I fail to recognize them as other faces of myself, then I am contributing not only to each of their oppressions, but also to my own. And the anger which stands between us then must be used for clarity and mutual empowerment, not for invasion by guilt or further separation. I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And I am not free as long as one person of color remains chained, nor is any one of you.
Greetings. We could really go home because you just preached the reading of the text today. Thank you. Thank you, and thanks to both of you. I want to thank you all for welcoming me into the sacred space of your worship community. I know that I am brought here by grace and also through the effort and hospitality of Dr. Oradain and Ms. Rachel Harris. I extend special greetings And thanks to President Williams and Dean Miller for cultivating a learning community filled with energy and diversity and prophetic learning. To Dr. Gaffney, whose scholarship and activism are important reflections, at least for me, of unapologetic commitments to Blackness and Black lives. To Dr. Steve Sprinkle, a mentor and a friend, who supported me particularly during a time when I was cultivating my voice as a Black queer theological ethicist. And to the rest of the faculty and staff and student body, especially those of you situated within marginalized identity categories and who experience oppressions through them, I greet you in love and peace. I appreciate that you've indulged me this opportunity for a mini roll call. It's not often that I get to offer one. I was raised in an old South Carolina Pentecostal church where roll call was a good part of the preaching moment, right? Most often, but not always, when there was a guest preacher, acknowledging our pastor, the keeper of the house, greeting the ushers and the choir, sharing a bit about connections with our community, honoring the children. It was a special moment in the service. And even though roll calls might sometimes reinforce hierarchies, right, and difficult dynamics of power, they also do something good. They help us acknowledge, especially in a context in which we can't take this for granted, the gift of our presence, that we made it here, that we owe our presence to God and to God's people, that the invitation to come and the ride to the service meant something to us. And for the enslaved folks, it meant recognizing that somebody had to steal away, that the long walk to meeting down dark, dusty roads in the small hours were fugitive efforts. Anybody from last night? The journey to worship with God and our people was not just a coming to, it was a leaving from. So acknowledging that people were there was in itself a process of giving thanks for the moments of freedom that can present themselves in holy gatherings. And this kind of holy communion, this loving energy that calls us to steal away together and that pushes us forward in freedom, is what I want to talk about today. So let's meditate together for just a few minutes on the topic, breaking our chains. Now, in the sacred text for today, both the Apostle Paul and Black feminist poet and essayist Audre Lorde warn us about the kind of bondage that's in place for all of us if we don't have real love for ourselves and our neighbor. Now, I know that Valentine's Day is upon us, right? Selling a certain kind of love through oversized stuffed animals, balloons, roses meeting their deaths in droves, right? But I know that Paul and Lorde are pointing to a different love, a liberating love, or really a love that bears the responsibility of liberation, of fulfilling the law and freeing the people. This is a love that heals wounds, that feeds empty bellies, protects the vulnerable, reconnects the estranged, bridges divides, dissolves boundaries. It's a love that breaks chains. I have to admit that whenever I read Paul's letter to the Galatians, I actually read it in a voice of Black women in my life. My mother and all of my aunties, my grandma, teachers, play cousins, ushers, those are the voices that I hear when I read that entire letter. The whole letter to me sounds in my head like an extended, I done told y'all. I done told y'all. Shared through gritted teeth and peppered with, I don't know why you don't listen. In my family, these were tones saved for when we had gotten on someone's last nerves, when we had exhausted the grace of, I'm going to tell you one more time. Paul is exasperated with his people because he has to tell them yet again that they are free, or actually, that they're called to freedom. He has to explain again in his most rudimentary, repetitive, speaking slowly so they can get it this time voice that Christ brought them freedom, that they are called to a state of liberty, and that within this calling is their release from the bondage of law. Paul is, in his own words, astonished, is what the text says, that the people are confused by a message of an alternate gospel. And of course, there is no other gospel, but still, the word on the street is that the Galatians are listening to some other people who are confusing them with another message. Even though Paul taught them about Christ's abolishment of the law through the teachings focused on trust and faith and love, some other folks have now come behind him with this other gospel that relies on Mosaic law, complete with circumcision here again, food and purity rules, sacrifices and offerings, details around celebrations, and so much more. I can imagine that Paul is astonished and irritated for multiple reasons. First, that he has to repeat himself about the law and freedom, even though he's scolded them, as he scolded them in the 3rd chapter of the letter. It was before their very own eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited and crucified. For him, turning away from his words and teachings is, quote, foolish, right? It's a clear result of them being bewitched. Can you imagine, right, that the pastor who started your church writes you a letter and in the letter calls you foolish and obviously bewitched, you know? You might think that he's a little bit irritated. For him, this turning away from words and teachings is the foolish experience of people who weren't listening. But he might also be astonished, and this would be true for me, because it's unclear why people would rather be bound to a law than be freed through love. You've been called to freedom, he yells in the text. Right? I can imagine the all caps version if this was a text, right? Exclamation points everywhere. Paul was sending an email or tweeting to the people. You don't have to do the same things you used to do. There's a whole new world out here. Right? So Paul's looking at them sideways, I imagine, because it seems ludicrous to have to come back and tell these people behind a set of perpetrators of fake gospels to reteach what should have been an easy lesson. But we all know what it's like to be a Galatian, don't we? We all know how foreign and far away freedom can seem when your world has been shaped by bondage and servitude, capture, and obligation. It's hard to wrap your mind around the concept of freedom. So I'm not surprised that since the Galatians' existence was embedded in a context of slavery to the law, that they had to be reminded over and over again, right? Sometimes we're so acclimated to our own oppression that someone has to unlock our chains over and over. Sometimes we don't know when there's no lid over us, or when the ceiling has been shattered, when the door has been opened, when the chains and the curtains have been pulled back, when the light is shining. Some of us haven't even been acclimated to what the sun feels like against our skin because we've been told that our melanin, our darkness, our freedom to be sun-kissed is a source of shame that should be repaid with bondage or death. So I kind of get the Galatians here, but I get Paul too. He's upset that the matter is up for debate again. It had been settled, and for their own sakes, the Galatians were supposed to remember the new life made possible through Christ. And we all know that the law doesn't work for everyone. Are we in this room agreeing on that? The law doesn't work for everyone, right? The law supported colonists' occupation of lands. The law supported genocide of entire peoples, erasure of indigenous folks' language and history and food supplies and clean water. The law supported the transportation of Africans to this land to provide unpaid labor in violent circumstances, the separation of Black mothers from their children, the burning of flesh as punishment for sexual and social misconduct. The law sanctioned the internment of our Japanese brothers and sisters, families. It denied a reparative response to that internment too. And right now, it allows for the detention of children at the nation's borders. Paul knows, that, like we do, that the law ain't friendly to all of us. The law is dangerous. It's perilous. It's a sure way to death for many of us. So I get the plea. Do not submit again to the yoke of the law, but lean into the new calling. The law might be some folks' concern, but freedom is everybody's business. But freedom ain't free, is it? I mean, it did actually already cost Jesus flesh and blood, This might be part of why Paul doesn't want the Galatians to use their freedom for self-indulgence, or as some translations say, the flesh. And we often read that as having to do with sexual indulgence or impurities. But partly I imagine that Paul is thinking about that the cost of the flesh, right? The pound of flesh that had already been given means that we ought not use our freedom to do things that miss that payment. So let's be honest about that. We do have a history that would make us feel like our freedom can only be tied up with our own bloodshed. It makes sense, especially for Black people, that we understand our flesh as a commodity, something to be traded and sold, a tax to be levied and collected. In fact, our flesh has been sacrificed as part of ongoing negotiations of the collective good. Like I mentioned last night, think of Emmett Till, whose flesh was sacrificed for the sake of life and service, and in service of white racial purity. Or consider Matthew Shepard, a young gay man whose flesh was sacrificed for the same thing. People don't always think about the ways that Emmett Till and Matthew Shepard are parallel experiences. It's the same story, the mitigation of the possibility of sexual flourishing, of social transgressions. We know about flesh and blood as payment, but the price of freedom is no longer our foreskins, the milk from our breasts, the skin whipped off our backs, the last breaths that we have. The price of freedom, as Paul explains to the Galatians, is our service to one another in love. Serve one another humbly in love, the letter says. Don't waste that freedom on meaningless self-indulgence. Instead, strive to promote one another's welfare. This is what it means to fulfill the law. This love is what you owe. It's the payment that you're indebted to. Loving your neighbor as yourself is the down payment, the mortgage, the insurance, the maintenance fees, right? It's the application fee, the tuition, the cost of books, or if I'm in the wrong crowd, it's the Uber ride, the cover charge, the 2-drink minimum, and the tip, right? Don't act like y'all hadn't been, okay, well, the wrong crowd. The cost of freedom that Christ offers can be paid by us through through nothing other than love. So then we have to ask ourselves, what would loving one another look like? I think for Paul in that context, it's about creating and sustaining community. It's about moving away from divisions, especially ones built on hierarchies that reinforce differences in power. Remember, in chapter 3, he points to oneness in community, right? Created by Jesus, neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. And those statements we've used to signify lots of important things, right? We've interrogated lots of constructions of gender, of bondage, right? And if we are made in their holy and collective image, if we are made in the image of God, already in communion, already sanctifying community over individuality, then the love that transpires between us, which then also binds us to one another, is holy and divine love. But more than that, it's our active love of one another, available and required through our freedom, that generates and then sustains life. At the root of this kind of love, I think, as freedom payment, is the way that we perceive one another. That is, our collectiveness, our connectivity, is key to the kind of love and relationship we must build. Love your neighbors as yourself. Lots of debates on what that means, right? Where the emphasis is placed. Love them for mere talents and experience as your own person created in the image of God, maybe. Love them as if they were you, perhaps. But either way, we know what it means to blur or even do away with lines that distinguish us. For Audre Lorde, those distinctions don't matter. The other faces of herself reflect the empty bellies that her children could have. The non-existent communities for the person coming out of the closet could be her experience. The lack of self-control about one's anger. The benefits of privilege don't matter if you don't see them as linked to another person. The freedom doesn't matter if we all ain't free. So freedom may not require my bloodshed, but it does call for attention to my neighbor. It calls me to love myself enough to know that then loving my neighbor is the joy and the reward of freedom. And if we miss that, if we miss our vocation to be freely and to love, then as Audre Lorde says, we are contributing not only to each of other people's oppressions, but also to our own. And we're leaving the chains intact. But if we see ourselves in the faces in front of us and recognize our longings and another person's desires, if we understand our joys to be connected with another's well-being, then we are living in the holy and beloved communion Christ created for us. Amen.